To kick us off, let's talk to Jonathan Davis, who's an economist and a wealth manager. Hello, Jonathan.
Hello, Julia.
Hello. I've got a funny feeling that the people whose wealth you manage think that money is rather crucial to happiness.
Well, you'd have to ask them directly about that. I think Professor Oswald, who wrote this study, has probably come up with a pretty obvious conclusion that if you've got money, you're generally going to be happier. The suggestion, though, that money is the sole cause of happiness is, of course, ridiculous.
Yeah.
But it certainly helps. I mean, if you can't feed your kids, you're going to be pretty unhappy. If you can't heat your house, you're going to be pretty unhappy.
Well, indeed, and there's a lot of evidence that one of the biggest causes of family breakdown and divorce is money worries, money problems, the stress that puts on people, on the husbands and wives and the partners when they are struggling to get by. I agree with you. Of course, it's not the sole cause of happiness. It's not sufficient to cause happiness, but is it a necessity? Are people who have money generally happier than people who don't?
Professor Oswald concludes that they are, and for what it's worth, I tend to agree. I mean, let's face it, with money, you can do more interesting things. You can have more enjoyment. This raises some, I think, deep psychological issues. In the 1940s, there was a sociologist by the name of Maslow. Some of your listeners may be aware of his hierarchy of needs. At the most basic level, we need food and shelter, and then security, freedom from fear, and so on. Right at the top of this pyramid, and it's a pyramid because very few people achieve what he called self-actualization, and I would suggest to you that the likes of, Elton John and Beyonce, I mean, they've got so much money, they can do basically whatever they want, say whatever they want, and they don't care what anyone thinks.
Oh, you see, now, I would argue that actually you can have too much money, and actually having so much money would actually bring either its own stresses, but also when you have to when you've got no sort of limit to your freedom and your choice, actually, I don't think we function. I mean, I'd be happy to try it out, but I think that actually that would bring its own problems.
Well, let's just consider that for a moment. If you got so much money that on a whim you hire a jet and go and watch U2 in Los Angeles, well, I'd suggest to you that's quite enjoyable for some people. Maybe other people don't want to watch U2, but you get the point I'm making. No doubt, having too much money brings its own issues. The richest lady in Australia, she's been in the news recently, she owns gold mines and iron mines and whatever, and she basically has written her kids out of her will because they just don't talk to each other anymore. So no doubt having an awful lot of money brings some problems, but everybody knows, and surely everyone who's listening to this program knows, that if you have some sufficient money for security, for freedom, for warmth, as well as enjoyment and all the fun things in life, I mean, let's face it, you're going to be a darn sight happier generally than if you don't have these things.
Indeed. Well, I mean, one of the things they looked at was scores depending on particular incomes, and people on more than £39,000 a year, so above the higher rate income tax threshold, scored higher on the happiness scale. But people sort of with more than that, they can actually fall down the income scale. There does seem to be this figure that's come up a few times in Britain that around the £40,000, you sort of get the optimum amount of happiness for the optimum amount of money. You don't have too much, but you don't have too many worries. But I imagine there'll be lots of people listening now who say, got to be honest with you, that sort of income, although well above average income, doesn't go very far in a city like London, and actually brings its own stresses and strains in terms of what you expect to be able to afford on that sort of salary, that sort of level of success, but what you actually can afford.
Absolutely, and particularly from a London broadcaster, I couldn't agree more. £40,000 of income in London actually doesn't go very far at all. And to go beyond that, looking long term, when we must bear in mind that people on average or above average incomes actually normally have above average debts as well. The reality is, one of my long-term hypotheses, unfortunately, is that we're actually in the throes of seeing the decimation financially of the middle classes. Because the reality is that incomes aren't rising much, but the costs of living are. Also, belying prime central London property, London and South East property is no longer rising, and I would assert that it's actually falling in price. Debts aren't falling.
Yes.
And indeed investments such as pensions in general, not my clients, hasten to say, are not keeping up with the costs of living. So over the long term, I think unless you're very wealthy, and I think we could reasonably say something like several £100,000 upwards, and I'm not talking about in property.
Yeah,
I mean,
actually in your bank account.
Well, indeed, in liquid investments,
Yeah.
unless you've got at least that kind of money, you're at serious risk of losing it all. Because if you lose your job, even if you've been earning £50,000, £80,000 a year, if you lose your job, you're very unlikely for the next 10 years to get that kind of income again, the way the global economy is moving.
Jonathan, I have to say, I was feeling quite happy till I spoke to you. Now I'm feeling really depressed.